Hey Captain, do we do anything besides engaging the autopilot in the cockpit? No. Greetings Skylovers, my name is Ivan and I'll be your pilot speaking for this video. And before you start asking questions, yes, I am at work. Currently I'm standby, but as you can see my uniform is also ready, so in case somebody calls. So greetings from my hotel room. So what do pilots actually do in the cockpit? How does the autopilot work? How often do we engage it? What happens if the autopilot doesn't work? Or even worse, what happens if it malfunctions? This episode is going to be divided in 3 parts. The cockpit preparation stage, how we prepare the cockpit and we make everything set for the flight. How does the autopilot work? But if you stay tuned until the end of this video, we're going to look into the official documents of the manufacturers regarding the usage of the autopilot and the recommendations, so that we can know when we can engage the autopilot or when we have to fly manually. So let's start with the cockpit preparation. So we have primarily 2 documents we use for the cockpit preparation. One we discussed in the previous episode, the SOP, and the other one we just mentioned, but it's the FCOM. Now what is important to mention here is that the SOP is created by the company and the FCOM is created by the manufacturer. Now in the SOP, the information is actually taken from the FCOM and put in the SOP. And as we said, the airline has the right to change it a little bit, but also they can make it more restrictive. So the pilot is expected to know the SOP, and by following it, I just got a message from my company. Hopefully I will not fly. I'm not flying, don't worry, we can continue with the video. God damn it, where was I? Ah yeah, the SOP. And each action and item to be performed is written in the correct order that it should be performed. And that way, when the pilot knows his SOP, he can quickly prepare the cockpit for the next flight. And if for some reason I'm not sure about some item, I can always check my SOP. Or if I want to get into a deeper explanation from the manufacturer, you guessed it right, I can check the FCOM. To illustrate why it's important to know your SOP, let's do a little experiment. Now, as I said, I am type rated for the Boeing 737. Let's do the electrical power up procedure for the A320. So let's see how much time it would take me to prepare it. For this experiment, we're going to use a simulator. And this video is not sponsored, but if anybody from X-Plane is watching, let's do something together. Now, you might be thinking, if you're a 737 pilot, how do you have the information about the electrical power up for the A320? And to that I can always say that now we're in the cockpit of an Airbus A320. So we have aircraft setup. Then we have general warning, do not pressurize the hydraulic system until clearance is obtained from ground personnel. To continue, we have engine 1 and 2 master levers off. So master levers are, which we can, weather radar and predictive wind shear. Switch both to off. This is a little bit different, but it's off. If you then captain display and first officer display modes both to off. Where the hell is this? Captain display mode selectors, I didn't find that in the simulator, so I'm sorry. People who fly at 320, please trash me in the comments. Now we can continue with the landing lever, which is located here, and as you can see, it's in the down position. See, there it is. Wiper off and wiper off. Battery 1 and battery 2 push button switches, both auto. So we go here and we press both them on auto, which are these 2. It says if the available light is on, external power push button switch on. So we do this. And the magic is happening. Okay, Skylovers, welcome aboard the Boeing 737-800, with which cockpit I'm a little bit more familiar with, right? Okay, so how we do it in this cockpit? So we go straight to the battery and we put this knob to on. Then we check that the standby power is closed and the alternate flaps are also closed. After that, following the procedure from the FCOM, we check that the wipers left and right are in the park position. We check the hydraulic system is set in the correct position, and this is the correct position. After that, we go to the landing gear, we check that it's down and we have 3 green. And the only thing we have to do is check if we have external ground power, which we do, and we turn it on. And that's it. Did you notice how fast I was with this one? That's because I've trained this procedure, I've done it 100 times, and it's just easier for me. I know where to look for, I know where to find things. This is very important, that every pilot has to know his cockpit, his airplane, his systems, and blah blah blah, pretty much know your airplane. It will be easy life. Okay, now you saw how the SOP works in practice in the cockpit. And that way the pilot is preparing the whole cockpit and he sets all the data and prepares all the systems in terms of the flight that we're about to do. We're talking pressurization, hydraulics, electrics, and of course the most important one for the autopilot, the FMC. So what essentially is an autopilot?
Hasta la vista, baby.
The autopilot is a computer, meaning that it would not engage on its own. It doesn't know what to do, and basically you have to micromanage it all the time in order to get the results that you want. Okay, the autopilot is a complicated system, and in itself it has a lot of other systems. But unfortunately, to understand how the autopilot works, we need to understand how all other systems work and how are they connected to the autopilot.
I don't like where this is going.
Okay, let's start with the brain of the airplane. I'm not talking about these two brains, I'm talking about these two brains, or the FMC. Now, the FMC stands for Flight Management Computer. And in this type of medium airplanes, you can remember that we have two systems for everything, and this is for redundancy. Because if you lose one of the systems, the other one is still working. So you have two FMCs, two autopilots, two pilots, a captain and a first officer, and so on and so on. Okay, so the FMC is the brain of the airplane. For example, it gets information from all the different sensors and probes that we have on the airplane. I'm talking about the pitot system, the static system, the angle of attack sensors, and so on and so on. Now, this information is very important for the FMC because based on it, the computer makes its calculations. But what are we calculating? And this is where the CDU comes in place. Now, CDU stands for Control Display Unit. The Control Display Unit is used by the pilots to communicate with the FMC and actually tell the FMC what we want it to do. Let's say we want to increase the speed, or we want to change our route to fly direct to another waypoint. That's when we're going to use the CDU to tell the FMC what we wanted to calculate. So now imagine that we just made a takeoff and now we're climbing. Now, when we're below 10,000 feet, do you really think it's a good idea to put our heads down and start typing in a computer? Or let's say in the approach phase, when we are below 10,000 feet, it really doesn't seem like a good idea to switch your eyes from looking outside to down looking at the computer. So the engineers came up with a great decision. They decided, instead of only using the FMC, to create the MCP. Now, MCP stands for Mode Control Panel, and this is the second way you can talk to the autopilot. As a matter of fact, 90% of the time you're going to be using the MCP to talk to the autopilot instead of the FMC. And it is really practical because the whole panel is situated just in front of both pilots, which means that it's easy to use from both the left seat and the right seat. And this gives us kind of shortcuts. For example, we can quickly click on the heading button and then we will engage the heading mode. Then we can rotate the heading knob and then the airplane would start flying with the desired heading. Now, some of the features, for example, like heading select or Vorlog, are only located on the MCP. But for example, the speed you can change either from the MCP using the speed window, or you can change it from the FMC. In either case, what is going to happen is that those changes are going to be sent to the FCC. Now, the FCC stands for the Flight Control Computer. Now, you can imagine the FCC like a really sophisticated calculator. Now, after the FCC has made its calculations, and the autopilot can perform the necessary movements, which then are sent to the control surfaces of the airplane in order for the airplane to take the attitude that we need to perform the maneuver. So, to sum it up, you can use either the FMC or the MCP to give commands to the autopilot via the FCC. Another very important component is the FMA, or the Flight Mode Annunciator. Now, this little window is located on the PFD, which stands for Primary Flight Display, and it is in this little window that we can observe if the modes that we have selected are actually engaged and working properly. Or in other words, is the airplane doing what I told it to do? And also if you're a Boeing 737 pilot, we have this little autopilot and autothrottle disengage lights, which are used if for whatever reason the autopilot or the autothrust disengages. They start to blink so that they can focus our attention on them. Now whenever we purposely disengage the autopilot and the autothrottle, or whichever one of those, let's say for example when we're landing, these lights will start blink for a second, but if we press the button that we use for the disengagement, let's say of the autopilot, then they will stop blinking. But in case the autopilot disengages for whatever reason when we didn't want it to disengage, the lights will blink again. And this is not exactly a situation that we want, but hey, it's a computer, sometimes it does stupid things. That's why we're there. Now you have these little buttons on the MCP which you can use to engage the autopilot. And then if the pilot has set everything correctly on the MCP and the CDU, the autopilot should engage and follow the orders that the pilot has inputted in one of those systems. And now we get to the last part, which is the autopilot and the autothrottle. Now it's very important to mention that the autothrottle and the autopilot are two completely different systems, meaning that you can use only the autopilot or only the autothrottle, or you can use both of them simultaneously, or you can use none of them. After the calculated information from the FCC is sent to the autothrottle and the autopilot, the autothrottle calculates how much the thrust levers have to move. And now we get to the last part, which is the autopilot will pitch up or pitch down. Basically it will do whatever it needs to do to satisfy the calculations and basically the commands we've given it on the MCP or the FMC. And as a matter of fact, we can see exactly what is going to be the movement of the airplane. Remember that the system was called Autopilot Flight Director System. Now with the help of the flight directors, or those two little switches, on our PFD we have this magenta cross line, which is a representation to the pilot showing exactly what kind of pitch, row and yaw we need in order to satisfy the calculations from the FMC or the MCP, and that the airplane can do exactly what we told it. Another cool thing is that even though the autopilot and the autothrottle might be disengaged, you can still use the flight directors if they're engaged. Let's say you want to fly with speed 250 knots and descend with 1000 feet per minute. The flight directors will show you exactly how you need to position the pitch, row and yaw if you're turning, but in this example I'm just giving the vertical speed, so it's basically the pitch, in order to perform the maneuver in the most efficient way. So are you starting to understand the statement that the pilots just engage the autopilot and that's all they're doing is really stupid? Because the autopilot is essentially a computer. It will do exactly what you told it to do. And therefore sometimes in the cockpit you can get into that situation where both pilots are looking at the autopilot and they're like, what is it doing right now? And 99% of the time is exactly what you told it to do. Of course, this is if we consider that there are no malfunctions with the system, but practice shows that more often than not it's the pilots who made a wrong input. So why do we use the autopilot? Of course, the most obvious reason is to reduce the workload. Now, although it's really fun to fly by hand using the yoke and the thrust levers, you do realize that after a couple of hours you'll be really tired. Because not only that you have to fly manually, but constantly in your head you have to do the calculations. Now, flying involves a lot of calculations constantly in your head. What should be my vertical speed for descent? How much do I have to turn the yoke so that I can achieve the required bank to turn the airplane to the left or to the right? So now when you're flying manually, not only that you have to do those calculations in your head, but you also have to use your hands to actually do the actions. Which, trust me, after a couple of hours you'll be dead tired. Which would mean that you would not be fit for your next flight. And this is where the autopilot comes in place. The autopilot allows the pilot to significantly reduce the workload, meaning that we don't have to manually perform all those actions, and provided that we set everything correctly in the FMC, the autopilot would do exactly what we told it, and all we have to do is monitor for its operation. Okay, so now that we understood how the autopilot works, you should know that although airplanes are different, the autopilot pretty much follows that simple logic that we just explained. For example, let's compare the Boeing 737 systems with the Airbus A320 systems. So in the Boeing 737 the computer is called FMC, Flight Management Computer. In the Airbus A320 it's called FMGC, Flight Management and Guidance Computer. Very important difference. In the 737 we have CDU, Control Display Unit. In Airbus A320 we have MCDU, Multifunctional Control Display Unit. I guess the one on the Boeing 737 is solo functional, and the one on the Airbus A320 also have different colors. Boeing 737 has the MCP, Mode Control Panel.
Sorry, what?
And the Airbus A320 have the FCU, or Flight Control Unit. The Boeing 737 have Auto Throttle, and the Airbus A320 has Auto Thrust. Now, especially with the throttle systems, there are significant differences, but as you can see, it basically serves the same function, and it's essentially the same system with a different name. Marketing, what can you do? But now let's move to the last part of the video, which is pretty much what happens if the autopilot doesn't work. The simple answer is we obviously have to manually fly the airplane. But there's much more to it behind it. I do realize the fact that one day the automation will be on such a high level that pretty much artificial intelligence is going to direct the whole flight. Of course, this can be said about cars, trucks, ships, every type of machine. But even then, machines can break. And I really don't know what will be the public opinion for that subject in 20 years. And in this channel we don't speculate. But in any case, the reality today is that we still use this type of autopilot, and despite that I explained that the FMC is the primary brain of the airplane, the real brains behind flying an airplane are the pilots. In the beginning I promised that we're going to check what the manufacturer in the official document says regarding the autopilot. The Normal Procedures Introduction in Volume 1 of the FCOM states that normal procedures are written for the trained flight crew and assume full use of all automated features. This statement is not intended to prevent pilots from flying the airplane manually. Manual flight is encouraged to maintain pilot proficiency, but only when condition and workload for both the pilot flying and pilot monitoring are such that safe operations are maintained. Many operators have developed an automation use policy that gives pilots the opportunity to maintain proficiency in manual flight. So as you can see, the manufacturer, in this case Boeing, encourages us pilots to keep our manual flight skills at a very high level and to practice whenever the conditions allow. Meaning that, for example, we know the airport, the conditions are visual meteorological conditions, there is no high traffic. Basically, we want to make sure that the environment and the workload is at such a low level that we can efficiently and safely perform a manual flight. It could be during the climb, during the descent. So why do they encourage us to keep our manual flying skills at a very high level? Well, there is this awesome movie which was made in the 90s, I believe. It's not really a movie, I think it's like a lecture or a seminar, but in any case, it touches exactly this subject. Now, you remember how we explained that the flight director system, based on the calculations and the inputs we put in the FMC, would be represented in the PFD, and they will give us commands how to fly the airplane. How much to descend, how much to turn, and the auto thrust, if engaged, will automatically put enough thrust to maintain the speed or the pitch or whatever it might be the case. Then remember how in one of the episodes we learned how easy it is for pilots to become overweight? If you haven't seen this episode, you can check it here. Just as easy, the pilots can become too reliant of the autopilot. Meaning that if these flight directors disappear, they would have a hard time manually flying the airplane. Because the flight directors are basically like side wheels on a bike. You can use the bike without them, but it's much easier to use it with them. But don't forget, we are the pilots. We are flying the airplane, not the other way around. So in that movie Children of the Magenta, which names come from the color of the flight directors, which is magenta, the lecturer really nicely explains the importance of flying the airplane manually whenever it's available for us, and keep training so that when the situation arises where we need to intervene and fly manually, we would not have any problem to do so. Now again, every airline company has its own policy in the way things are done and whether it wants to engage the autopilot immediately after takeoff, or it might be the case where the airline encourages its pilots to fly the airplane manually, let's say up to a higher level. But no matter what is the policy of the airline company, It's the pilot's duty to keep their flying skills at a very high level. That way, no matter what happens, we know that in any case we can take control of the airplane manually and safely fly the airplane feeling comfortable. Of course, the more you practice, the more comfortable it will be and the more confident you will be in your skills. So Skylovers, I hope that now you have a better understanding on how does the autopilot work, when do we engage it, when do we need it, and when the autopilot is not necessary but manual flying is encouraged. So now you know that although the autopilot is there to relieve the workload of the pilot, it is the pilot who is controlling the autopilot all the time. So Skylovers, that was my time for this episode. I know this one was a little bit more technical than usual, but in order to understand how the autopilot works, we needed to go through all those systems. So we did talk how the pilot is communicating with the autopilot, but how is the pilot actually controlling the airplane? How does the pilot increase the speed of the airplane? How does the pilot descend? So in the next episode, I'm going to show you as a Boeing 737 pilot what are the inputs I do on the MCP and how I give commands to the autopilot. So if you like this video, share, subscribe, comment, do whatever you want. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.